Well, hello. My name is Ripley Atkinson. I'm the Australian Livestock and Commodities Manager for StoneX based in Sydney, Australia, where we're developing price risk management tools for the Australian livestock industry with our Australian feeder cattle swap. Today, in the Australian cattle and beef markets, let's have a look at how cattle in the country are travelling distances further than the length of some countries. And importantly, what the imbalance of supply dynamics at the minute mean for the beef industry in the longer term outlook, where numbers are moving and the numbers out of Northern Australia are effectively supplying two markets or most of the eastern seaboard market in the country. But I'll start with the distances transported or the distances some cattle in Australia are transported at the minute across the country. And because of the vast nature of Australia's livestock sector and just the nature of the country itself and the distances we have to travel to get places, at the minute, we're starting to see some cattle in Australia travel further or 1.5 times more than the entire length of England. So some cattle at the minute are being travelled or transported over 2,150 kilometres to reach their end market destination. The length of England is roughly around 1,400 kilometres. So it gives you an idea of the scale of the country and the length of time it takes. Some of this might take up to a week for cattle to be transported, and they may be on the road for anywhere between 8 to 14 hours a day, with rest in between that as well. On top of this, obviously, the cost of doing and completing such an exercise is significant. So to transport those cattle I just spoke about over 2,100 kilometres, or more than 1.5 times the length of England and its entire country, you're looking at sums over $200 a head. Now, on one truck, you fit roughly 70 to 80 animals per truck. That's more than 15,000 Australian dollars simply to get those animals to market. And if we said you did that on 500 head, you're looking roughly at 150 to $200,000 simply to transport those animals to reach their end market destination. So significant volumes in terms of price, and the cost of doing this is substantial, but also importantly, the numbers at the minute. In 2025, we've seen literally thousands of head of cattle move from the states of Queensland and New South Wales and the Northern Territory down into South Australia and Victoria. And I'll get into what and the reasons why that's happening now. And ultimately, it's because of drought in southern regions of the country. If you drew a line across Australia at Sydney on the eastern seaboard in the state of New South Wales, that region is going through one of its worst droughts in living memory. And what that's done is force farmers to reduce their cattle numbers because of a lack of available grass and feed resources to feed their stock. And what that in turn has meant is the supply in southern Australia has continually constricted. Now, on the flip side, northern regions of the country have been experiencing fantastic seasonal conditions, and rain has continued to fall. There's plentiful availability of grass and there's large numbers of cattle. What we're seeing now is the dynamic of competing seasons, where the north is in good seasonal conditions above Sydney, and below Sydney, the livestock regions and cattle regions specifically are in bad seasonal conditions. Northern Australia, particularly Queensland's cattle herd as a percentage of the national total is 52%. So Queensland is the vast supplier of cattle in the country and has the most number of stock. So over the last few months, this dynamic at play has been Northern Australia, north of Sydney, has been effectively supplying both its own northern market and also finished and feeder stock available to be sold into the southern markets as well. And this is why we're seeing cattle be transported such a long distance, because those southern market buyers and participants are travelling long distances into the northern markets to access supply so they can continue to meet their requirements of, export market quotas and things like that with the contracts they have overseas and locally as well. And obviously, that added competition between the two participants, north and south, has been very supportive of price. But we now need to consider what does the longer term repercussions look like for the industry when the north is effectively supplying the entire eastern seaboard, and what this supply imbalance looks like. Because there's no cattle in the south, the north is supplying both its own market and the southern markets as well. When we get to a situation where the cattle cycle changes, there is the potential to be looking at some really intense structural issues in terms of availability of supply. So when the cattle cycle moves and the northern industry moves into a liquidation because seasonal conditions are in drought-like conditions, what will happen is the north will find itself much shorter of cattle when a rebuild then can then begin on the other side of that, as the cattle cycle moves out of its liquidation and cattle producers, that is, start to look to rebuild numbers, which in turn will push naturally higher demand. Underlying that is a shorter supply, and that will be very supportive, or what you could say artificially inflate demand and cattle prices here in Australia, because of the imbalance we see now in 2025. This might be 2 to 3 years away, but now in 2025, the north supplying both markets, that pull away of cattle in the north that otherwise would have stayed there are now moving out of that region. And in turn, when that cattle cycle moves, we go into liquidation and come out the other side, and producers look to restock. There is the potential that we see significant upward pressure in cattle prices because of the reduction in cattle numbers or available numbers in Northern Australia. That's all for this week. There's some really unique and interesting dynamics at play here in the Australian market currently, and it's important to remain, ahead of the market and others when understanding these trends and drivers, and recognizing what they mean for the future. But for more content like this, feel free to head to Apple or Spotify, search for the Australian Cattle and Beef Market Report, which is our fortnightly podcast covering supply, demand, price in the local markets, looking at exports and global factors affecting the Australian beef industry. Make sure to subscribe to this episode on StoneX TV or the podcast, and we look forward to chatting to you next time. Thank you for listening today, and until then, for more content, we look forward to seeing you soon.